presencia, la participación de ustedes. Y tenemos el gusto de comenzar el análisis de otra de las perspectivas, sectores poblacionales igualmente vinculados en este diverso estudio. En este caso, lo relativo al grupo LGBTI y las necesidades de protección internacional en las Américas en el contexto del derecho internacional de los refugiados existente. Agradecemos igualmente la presencia y celebramos de nuestra expositora, doña Pamela Goldberg. Ella es oficial de protección, especialmente vinculada al trabajo de análisis en la oficina pertinente en el tema de refugiados en Washington, en Estados Unidos, de manera que mil gracias por su concurso y adelante en la exposición.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I know it's a little hard to start after lunch, but hopefully we'll get going. I've heard that you're a very active and enthusiastic audience, so I'm looking forward to that. And I also want to express our thanks to the OAS for inviting us to participate in this great opportunity to address you all on the issues that are of such great importance and concern to us at UNHCR. What I'm going to do, as you know, is address some of the issues relating to the protection needs of individuals who are what's called LGBTI, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transsexual, or intersexual, or what's also known as sexual orientation and gender identity. And I will be looking at claims, the kinds of claims that we are seeing from states within the Americas. And what I will do first is define these terms just so that we all have a common understanding. And there are many places where these terms are defined that I will reference to you all as I go along, but just so that it's clear from the outset what I mean about these terms. And then I will then go to give some factual scenarios of the different kinds of harm that people face throughout the Americas based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. Then I'll provide a brief overview of the some of the international sources for protection, UNHCR sources for protection of people on this basis, as well as OAS sources of protection, and we'll discuss in the course of that some of the key terms that I know you've already looked at in terms of the refugee definition and persecution. I want to just point out, of course, the topic is far too broad and far too deep for us to have a full discussion today, but I hope you will take away two things from this session. One, that individuals who are persecuted or who fear persecution because of their sexual orientation or gender identity need to have great consideration paid to their concerns, and to ensure that those in need of protection receive it. And two, that you will come away with a greater appreciation and understanding of this area of the law and of refugee and human rights protection. So let me start by defining quickly some of the key terms. Sexual orientation and gender identity, or as we fondly refer to it in UNHCR, SOGI. I'll start with that. Sexual orientation refers to an individual's romantic, emotional, psychological, or physical connection to another sex. So it could be a person is heterosexual, could be homosexual, could be a transgendered person, which I'll define in a minute, who is now attracted to people of the gender they've changed to, or is now attracted to people of the gender that they left. It's all about how a person, or to whom a person is drawn to have their most intimate relations with. Gender identity, on the other hand, is how a person sees themselves in the world. And of course, most people who are male see themselves as male, and most people who are female see themselves as female. But there are many people in the world who do not. There are women who see themselves as men, there are men who see themselves as women, and so that is a matter of how a person identifies themselves in the world vis-a-vis their sex and or their gender. And just briefly, to be clear, the difference between sex and gender. So sex really refers to the biological markings of your sex, male or female. Gender refers more to the cultural and social norms and roles and expectations. So, for example, happily today it's not so universally true, but at one time it was broadly true that the gender role for a woman was to stay home and have babies and take care of the house and the husband and the children. That's a gender role. So someone who has a gender identification as female, even though they're male, they may wish to take care of babies. They may wish to dress as females. They may wish to do other things that are traditionally or stereotypically identified with that gender, with that sex. Lesbian and gay or homosexual, you probably all know. Lesbian is a woman who is drawn for her soul or primary emotional, romantic, or physical attachment to other women. Gay is the same of men towards other men, although the term gay is also used broadly to refer to anyone who is homosexual. But when I use it, I'll try to be very clear. If I'm not using it to refer to men, I will be specific that I'm using the term broadly. Bisexual is someone who has a preference for, or who has an attraction, be it emotional, physical, romantic, to both sexes. And it could be at different times in their lives. It could be at the same time. They might have a preference for one more than the other, but they do have feelings of that nature for both sexes. Transsexual is someone who, as similar to the gender identity issues we were talking about a minute ago, transgender is someone who strongly identifies with the sex that they are not biologically. And in some cases, those individuals will actually have surgery or medical treatments to alter their biological appearance, but not necessarily. And then intersex are individuals, and this is probably the least common in the spectrum. Those are people who are born or who somehow acquire through whatever may happen in their lives, ambiguous or contradictory biological markings. So hermaphrodite, for example, is an example of an intersex being. Someone whose physical genitalia and appearance is not completely consistent with one sex or the other. So those are those key terms that I wanted to lay out. And I want to also stress that when we're talking about individuals seeking protection, they may or may not use these terms. They may or may not even see themselves by these terms. These are the kind of sociological definitions that have evolved around the different ways that people express themselves sexually and in terms of their gender. Another point that I want to make is that not all SOGI, people or LGBTIs, are visibly apparent. you know, we all know about drag shows where, or I assume we all know in the 21st century, where men dress very flamboyantly as women and do impersonations and sing Barbra Streisand songs. I don't know if you all know that cultural reference, but that's one extreme example. But we could have any number of lesbian or gay people in this room, and we would never know unless they told us. So it's not always apparent, and that's important because when adjudicators look at a claim for protection, that's an important factor that we always urge them to keep in mind. On the other side of that spectrum, when you're talking about the need for international refugee protection, there's no requirement that the person must be discreet. There's no requirement that says, well, you don't have to be flamboyant. You don't have to hold hands with your partner in public. And if you don't do those kinds of things, then you won't face any harm. That, in the view of UNHCR, is a very inappropriate position to take, because it means a person has to close off an essential part of their identity, whether they want to or not. Some people choose to, many don't. So having said that, let me talk for a little bit about, you all now, I know, have been hearing about the refugee definition, and one of the key components is that there must be a fear of harm or persecution that is has been committed, or the fear that it will be committed based on a person's race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. And in the context of these kinds of claims, it most likely comes up under the social group category. And that topic in itself is a very huge topic in terms of its evolution in the law. But for our purposes today, I think it's enough for you to understand that when we talk about a member of a particular social group, what we look for principally is that members of that group possess a characteristic that is either immutable or innate, something they're born with, or something that is not changeable, or that is so fundamental to their sense of self and their human dignity that they should not be required to change it. And in the view of UNHCR and of a number of states, sexual orientation and gender identity falls within that understanding of what we would call a protected characteristic is. So most of the claims that we see tend to fall under that category, though not exclusively. Now, persecution, as I'm sure you've already heard today, is not only about extreme violence or torture. It can be lesser forms of violence. It can be violations of fundamental human rights. It can be physical harm. It can also be psychological or mental or emotional harm. It does have to rise to a high enough level, and I'm sure you've talked about that over the course of today. So it's not just any bad thing that happens to anyone, but there's no exact and exclusive definition of what would constitute persecution. So it's very fluid, and it very much reflects the social realities and norms of our times. Or I should say it's intended to, by the view of the drafters of the convention and by UNHCR and by many others. It also, the harm may be inflicted by a state actor or by a non-state actor where that occurs in a country where the state is either unwilling or unable to provide protection to that individual for the reasons of their sexual orientation or gender identity in this context. There's no requirement that an individual who fears or has suffered persecution at the hands of a private actor, that they must report it to the police to show that they would not get protection, because in many circumstances, that kind of reporting would be futile, and it can be documented and shown that in certain countries, no matter what lesbian or gay person might do, the authorities will not lend them protection. So that's another component when we're looking at that issue in the context of asylum protection. In the Americas context, most of the claims, by far, are seen brought in either the U.S. or Canada. And this is even though in many countries within the Americas, although not the U.S. or Canada, the refugee definition has been expanded to include either gender or sex as one of the protected categories. And that's another issue that there's a lot of debate and discussion about whether that's a good thing or a necessary thing or not. But suffice it to say that in many countries in the Americas, there is room for these kinds of claims to be viable under the law. But the social attitudes in many countries, if not the specific laws, are such that it's very unlikely for an individual to raise a claim based on their sexual orientation or gender identity in most countries within the Americas. A few have been raised and have been seen, but by far it's in those two countries. And so when I speak about it, I'm really talking about the perspective largely from US and Canada. However, on the other hand, we have seen claims in the US and in Canada from throughout the Americas. So I'll give you a handful examples of where we have seen claims arising. And these are not in any particular order. From Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, Chile, Argentina, Guyana, Nicaragua, Ecuador, Brazil, Colombia, Peru, El Salvador, Cuba, Jamaica, Haiti, and even, in fact, I was surprised to find from St. Kitts. So they come from all over. And I'll give you a few examples. A gay man in Costa Rica claimed that he was raped by a police officer because of his homosexuality. A gay man in Venezuela was sexually abused by police officers, also because of his homosexuality. A gay man from Ecuador claimed that he faced anti-discrimination in Ecuador because of his sexual identity, which included arrest, detention, mistreatment, and even persecution, even torture, excuse me. An Argentinian man was arrested and beaten on at least 20 occasions when he left gay disco clubs at late at night by police. A lesbian from Venezuela was harassed repeatedly by the police in her country because of her sexual orientation. A Mexican male to female transsexual, so he was born male and his gender identity was female, and he presented himself as such from an early age. He was expelled from school for dressing, appearing, and acting as a female. He was harassed and mistreated by the police, and including he was forced to perform oral sex and to be sodomized by a police officer holding a gun to her head as she identified herself. A lesbian from Colombia was raped and tortured based on her sexual identity. Another lesbian from Colombia was fired from her job when she told her coworkers about her sexual identity. Overall, there are not very many, or there are not nearly as many cases of lesbians as there are of gay men and of transsexuals that we have seen in the US and Canada. And one of the issues for these kinds of, for individuals with, who face persecution based on their sexual orientation or gender identity is that they often don't realize that that is a basis to seek protection. So that's another issue that we often have to confront. Two cases that I want to mention to you. One is a case from a gay man from Cuba, one of the very first cases in the U.S. to recognize homosexuality as a basis for protection. because this gay man, it was in 1990, and he claimed that he would be persecuted based on his sexual orientation. And the other was in 1997, a lesbian from Russia who was forced to be institutionalized in a mental institution and undergo treatment to correct her sexual orientation as a lesbian. And the courts in the U.S. held that even though the intention was not punitive, it was not meant to be harmful for her, but the fact that she experienced it as harm and that it was infringing on one of her fundamental rights was sufficient to the court to say she was deserving of protection of asylum in the United States. Now, I want to give you some of the underpinnings of the international sources of protection for people based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 1, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And Article 2, everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration, has been interpreted to include sexual orientation and gender identity. Then the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, in an ICCPR general comment on non-discrimination, issued language that says that the committee believes that the term discrimination, as used in the covenant, should be understood to imply any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference, which is based on any ground such as, and it gives the standard race, sex, color, etc., or any other status, and which has the purpose or effect of nullifying or impairing the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise by all persons on an equal footing of all rights and freedoms. So those are two examples of international human rights documents that have been interpreted to include protection against discrimination and against harm of people based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. Then UNHCR in particular, although this is not a binding document, I want to point out, let me just find the document here, has issued what we call guidelines on international protection. We've issued a series of 9. Many of you may be familiar with the UNHCR handbook that that provides UNHCR's view of how to interpret and apply the Refugee Convention definition and terms. Following that handbook, UNHCR has been issuing a series of guidelines on international protection that are intended to expand and further develop the UNHCR's understanding of the meaning of the convention terms in line with the current developments in the law and in social understandings of evolution and understanding of human rights and all of those kinds of things. And our most recent guidelines are guidelines for claims to refugee status based on sexual orientation or gender identity within the refugee definition. And these guidelines provide a lot of analysis about how and why these kinds of claims may satisfy the refugee definition and may lead to an individual to receive protection based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. UNHCR, of course, has a number of other documents that speak to this issue. This is the most recent, and probably, although it's not legally binding, it's probably could be seen as the most authoritative of our statements on that issue. Then moving to the OAS, you may be aware, or maybe not, that in 2008, a resolution was adopted on the human rights, sexual orientation, and gender identity. And I'll just read a little bit from that one for you, because that's the first one, and there's several that follow that, and they basically reiterate these same principles, except with each successive resolution, the language gets a bit more forceful. So this very first one states that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights affirms that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, and that everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in that declaration without distinction of any kind. That the American Declaration of the Rights and Duties of Man establishes that every human being has the right to life, liberty, and the security of person. And that the Charter of the OAS proclaims the historic mission to offer a land of liberty and a favorable environment for the development of personality and realization of just aspirations, and reaffirming the principles of universality, indivisibility, and interdependence of human rights. And here's where we start to see, this is the first, and you'll see how the language changes a bit, noting with concern acts of violence and related human rights violations perpetrated against individuals because of their sexual orientation and gender identity, resolves to express concern about these acts of violence. So that was the first OAS resolution. In 2009, there was a second one where it again reiterates all of what I said up to noting with concern, and then it says resolves not just to express concern, but now to condemn acts of violence and related human rights violations committed against individuals because of their sexual orientation and gender identity, and to urge states to ensure that these kinds of acts are investigated and their perpetrators are brought to justice. Again, this was reiterated in 2010, and in 2011, it adds, resolves, it again heightens the commitment, resolves to condemn discrimination against persons by reason of their orientation and gender identity, to condemn acts of violence and human rights violations, and it provides other dictates for encouraging states to consider, to adopt public policies against discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. And then lastly, on the OAS front, in 2012, the Permanent Council of the OAS Committee on Juridical and Political Affairs issued a study on sexual orientation and gender identity and gender expression, and provides an understanding of key terms and standards. So those are sort of some of the key documents in the OAS system that address the right of individuals to be free from harm and discrimination based on their sexual orientation and gender identity. Then there are just a few more things that I want to mention before I conclude so that there's time for question and answer. In 2006, a group of individuals and NGOs enacted what are called the Yogyakarta Principles on the application of international human rights law in relation to sexual orientation and gender identity. And these are non-binding. The signatories, which include from the Americas, Argentina, Brazil, Canada, Costa Rica, and the US, are people who signed in their individual capacity or as representatives of some organization, but not as representing the government of the state. These are not binding, but they are persuasive. And among the rights that they articulate are the right to universal enjoyment of human rights, equality and non-discrimination, security of the person, freedom, privacy, right to found a family, right to seek asylum. And then some of the additional recommendations that you might be interested in, which are not part of the principles, but in particular, they lay out regional and sub-regional intergovernmental organizations with a commitment to human rights, as well as regional human rights treaties bodies should ensure that the promotion of these principles is integral to the implementation of their human rights mandates, mechanisms, and procedures. and that regional human rights courts should vigorously integrate these principles into the relevant treaties that they interpret and into their developing case law on sexual orientation and gender identity. So even though it's not binding, it is an important document, historical document, and really has helped to raise the understanding and the acceptance that this kind of harm, violence, and discrimination is does constitute, or do constitute, because there are many different kinds, do constitute or may constitute human rights violations and are worthy of providing protection to those individuals who are at the receiving end of it. I want to just briefly mention one more thing that I think is interesting, and you all may know that in 2012 the Inter-American Court of Human Rights issued a decision, the Atala decision, which was a claim brought by a woman, a Chilean woman, who at the time of her divorce from her husband came out as a lesbian, and although all the lower courts, including the Court of Appeals in Chile, granted her custody of their 3 daughters, the Chilean Supreme Court overturned that and denied her custody. And the Inter-American Court overturned that decision. 13 years later, she missed out on a lot, but overturned that decision. And among the interesting things that they rule in this decision are, first of all, recognizing sexual orientation as a category protected by Article 1.1 of the American Convention, and recognized her right to equality and non-discrimination, as well as her right to a private life and the right to a family life. So that's a very historical moment for OAS, I believe. This decision, even though it doesn't have to do with asylum, it does have to do with recognition of these issues as affecting and being affected by fundamental human rights and freedoms. So what I want to leave you with now in conclusion is that it is very difficult to draw any broad conclusions about how sexual orientation and gender identity is treated across the Americas. In some cases there are positive laws, but they're not adhered to or enforced. In other cases there are negative laws, but those are not adhered to and enforced. But in general, the climate is still such that few people feel safe to raise these kinds of claims throughout most of the Americas. And as I said, Canada and the U.S. do have the best records in the region in terms of recognizing the protection needs of individuals based on their sexual orientation and gender identity. But even in these 2 countries, the case law is very varied and not at all consistent. And very similar facts can be found to constitute a claim in one jurisdiction and not constitute a claim in another jurisdiction. So we still have a long way to go. So as I stated in the beginning of my presentation, I hope you will take from this session 2 things: that individuals who are persecuted or fear persecution based on their sexual orientation or gender identity deserve serious consideration of their protection needs, and that you have a greater appreciation and understanding of this complex, interesting, and very important area of human rights and refugee protection. Thank you, and I open the floor for questions or comments.
Vamos a hacer la sesión de preguntas una vez hagamos las 2 primeras presentaciones. Agradecemos de manera muy especial, doña Pamela, la presentación ilustrada, seria, en un tema tan importante. Igualmente le agradecemos el uso riguroso del tiempo. Y al finalizar la próxima exposición le abriremos un espacio de preguntas y comentarios sobre este tema tan importante. Igualmente saludamos de manera muy especial a los señores embajadores de Haití, de nuevo nuestro vicepresidente, y al embajador de Jamaica, Stefan Bassiani, quien amablemente nos honra con su presencia, y tendremos el gran orgullo y gusto de más adelante de escuchar su presentación. A continuación tenemos la exposición del señor Buti Keil, representante regional adjunto de la Oficina Regional de ACNUR para Estados Unidos de América y el Caribe, además de su formación. El señor Keil, con su origen sudafricano y su experiencia viviente en varios países de África, pues tiene una gran oportunidad para nosotros, desde luego, para escuchar sus importantes reflexiones en el tema que le corresponde, básicamente sobre lo atinente a la cooperación internacional. De manera que tiene usted la palabra.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be here, and I don't understand Spanish, but I suppose I just heard my name and then I came running, and I suppose that the ambassador was introducing me as well as the Deputy Regional Representative of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, based here in Washington, D.C., and accompanied by a good number of colleagues, one of them, Pamela, who is one of our lawyers based here, and two other colleagues who come from Costa Rica and Panama, who are here and who have brought us this difficult weather. Before they arrived yesterday, it was very nice, but they will be leaving tomorrow maybe with some snowflakes. It's a pleasure again for me to be here and to give you an overview of what we understand by international cooperation. And the first thing, I can't see who will be spinning the slides, but are you helping with the slides? Okay. A second. Yeah, I do. You want it? No. Okay. Thanks. Now, with regard to a lot of international concepts, the concept or the notion of international cooperation is not clearly defined, but we do see it in the preamble of the 1951 Convention relative to the status of refugees, wherein the preamble itself affirms that in order for the refugee challenges to be faced squarely, there has got to be international cooperation. First and foremost, before I continue with with the content of my presentation, let me just give you the bird's eye view of what I am going to cover. And one is international cooperation itself, the notion, and two, the context in which it is recommended, and why it is important to have international cooperation, and the purpose of international cooperation, and what it means in practical terms, and the forms and examples of international cooperation, and I will conclude. And I have already said that it is found in the preamble of the 1951 Convention relative to the status of refugees, and which urges states to cooperate in order to resolve refugee challenges. The second thing is that it is also referred to in a number of legal documents and as well as executive conclusions of UNHCR and a number of regional organizations as well. And then the concept itself entails all cooperation between a number of stakeholders. And to start with host countries and third countries, NGOs, inter-governmental organizations, civil society, etc. And the international protection regime is predicated on the very notion of international cooperation. And because we do know that a refugee is a person who is no longer under the protection of his country of origin or of habitual residence, but enjoys international protection that is provided through proxy by the host state. And two other things that are worthy noting is that burden shifting is not international cooperation. And by that you mean you are not going to try and run away from your responsibilities as a state and say that let somebody else carry the load instead of me as a host state to do so. And the other thing is that not because there is lack of international cooperation, we can have the pretext of not upholding one's international obligations. So there isn't any exemption because there is lack of cooperation on the part of other states. The context, and we can see international cooperation in about four contexts. One is emergency situations that warrants a multi-stakeholder intervention. And there isn't a clear-cut definition of mass influx, but it is characterized by a number of things. And one of them is a significant number of people who cross an international border, and the rate at which these people cross the international border, and this we have experienced in a certain number of contexts. And it is also characterized by the presence where they exist of individual asylum procedures, and also the inability on the part of the host government to deal with the assessment of such a significant number of people. And the second thing is concerns protracted refugee situations. And two things to say with regard to protracted refugee situations. Here you have at least 25,000 individuals who pretty much come from the same country and are of the same profile, and they have been in that situation for at least 5 years. And the third context is that of irregular secondary movements. And here it is a group of people or an individual who, after having obtained asylum in one country, decides to move in an irregular fashion to a third country. And there is a way states are trying to regulate this kind of movement, which is obviously discouraged. And the last context is that of trafficking and smuggling. It is important because of a number of issues. Refugee challenges cannot be resolved by one single country. It is very difficult. And it depends again on the capacity of countries, but in most cases, there are certain countries that do receive hundreds of thousands of refugees at a go, and it is virtually impossible for these countries to be able to deal squarely with such large numbers of asylum seekers or refugees. The second thing is that international solidarity and cooperation underpin, as I said, the international refugee regime. And as it is currently, you've got 80% of all refugees who are hosted by developing countries. In most cases, developed countries or countries in the north are pretty much secured in a sense that they are not surrounded by refugee-producing countries. And unfortunately, all these conflicts that trigger refugee movements are located in the developing world. And as a result, these are the ones who bear the brunt of the significant numbers of refugees and asylum seekers. The other thing is that there is an insufficient understanding and recognition of the impact that hosting such large numbers of people has on host countries, and that has got to be acknowledged. Now, the purposes of international cooperation are manifold, and I have identified about 9 of them. The first one is to solve problems of a humanitarian nature. The second one is to enhance respect by states for their protection responsibilities, lest they claim that they are not in the position to do so because of the sizable number of people that they have got to cater to. And the third thing is to strengthen the protection regime. And again, irregular secondary movements tend to erode the protection regime. Thus, the need to look into it, prevent it, and try and find a fair and effective solution to the phenomenon. And to resolve the plight of refugees, to promote peace, stability, and dialogue. It is to be recalled again that asylum is not an inimical or a hostile act, but it is a humanitarian gesture. It is also a responsibility on the part of states that have acceded to the 1951 Convention or to its protocol of 1967. It also contributes to an effective international response. This response has got to be coordinated, and that way it engenders a better and qualitative response to some of the challenges that refugees are faced with. It also reduces and shares the burdens of host countries, especially, like I indicated, those who are in the developing world. And again, when you are involved in a multi-stakeholder action, you tend to find a satisfactory solution to a challenge. And the last thing is to, the purpose again of international cooperation is to find more effective and predictable responses thanks to the coordination mechanisms that countries tend to come up with. We'll see some of the examples in the area of international cooperation. Now, in practice, what happens is a number of things that happen either during the emergency period or after the emergency period, what we call care and maintenance. You still need international support, and I have now enumerated a certain number of practical measures that the international community adopts in order to try and alleviate the burden that is on the shoulders of countries that are hosting refugees. And one of them is providing financial support and technical assistance to host countries. Because when you are a country, for example, Congo, that received hundreds of thousands of Rwandese refugees in the mid-1990s at the same time, at a very, very high rate of arrival into the country, and combined as well with elements that were armed. It was practically the entire Rwandese army that had crossed into Congo. The Congolese authorities at that time needed massive assistance from the international community in order to feed those who were crossing into their territory, and as well as to try and separate the combatants from the civilian population. Quite a Herculean task for the Congolese government, And without international assistance, it would have been virtually impossible to face that kind of situation. And at the local level, again, the establishment of mechanisms. How do we come to provide assistance to numerous people, the host country and the other stakeholders? And in this case, it is donor countries. It is also other countries that could come in a variety of ways. And that could be sending a team of engineers in order to assist, for example, with the erection of shelter. It could be tents. It could be prefabricated material as well in order to provide a roof to arriving asylum seekers. The mobilization of adequate resources, there are several ways in which this is done. It is a special appeal that is done just the day following, or even the very same day, a flash appeal which is sent out in order to try and get support from the international community, and the ERC, the Emergency Relief Coordinator as well, based in New York, who is going to release funds in order for the country to be able to meet some of the primary or the basic needs of the population. Now, the assistance as well for the establishment of some of the mechanisms. In certain contexts, it is important to look into individual cases and see if people are in need of international protection. In other cases, for example, in Africa, where there is the OAU convention that states that people who arrive because of a known situation in their country of origin could be recognized as refugees en masse or as a group, which is called a prima facie recognition. They are accepted that way until proven otherwise. It will come a time when there is a need for the government to try and assess individually whether certain people may not be in need or may not be deserving of international protection. And at the international level, I'm deliberately skipping a few others because I can see that you're reading them at the same time. At the international level, again, there is an effort that is made in order to create some framework of coordination. How do we make sure that we come in and resolve certain issues? It could be on smuggling, on trafficking. It could be the issue of refugee status determination, or any other area that is problematic for the host country. There are forms of international protection, and in most cases, we're looking at comprehensive regional approaches. The advantage there is that there is a lot of flexibility at the regional level. At the global level, it's almost impossible. Maybe that's why those who are wise had decided that, yes, there is the existence of the United Nations, but you do also need regional entities in order to look into the specificities of certain regions. And in the same way, here again, you are looking at regional frameworks because they are better adapted to local realities, and they can operate in a swifter fashion than when you're looking at it at the global level. You have examples of international cooperation. A good number of you, I'm sure, have heard about the CPA, or the Comprehensive Plan of Action for Indo-Chinese refugees, so-called boat people, back in the 80s, whereby the international community had come up with a plan in order to try and find a durable solution, which also entailed resettling a good number of Indo-Chinese refugees to other countries, including to the US. In this hemisphere in the 80s as well, because of the situation obtaining in Central America, there was the International Conference on Central American Refugees, and I am fast forwarding to go right up to the Mexico Plan of Action. There it goes, yes. The Mexico Plan of Action that came up with the three pillars, one which is borders of solidarity, and then solidarity cities, and solidarity resettlement. And the third one being a typical, again, example of international cooperation, where the plan was to try and assist countries like Ecuador and Costa Rica that were receiving a sizable number of Colombians in order for Colombians to be resettled to other countries like, for example, Argentina, Uruguay, and two other countries. The most recent initiatives in this respect, and these concern primarily regional approaches. I've got them there. You've got about 5 of them from 2002 with the Bali process that was triggered by the Tampa crisis, where about 400 people were in this boat called, they were rescued by a boat called Tampa, and Australia had refused to let the boat dock, and as a result, they were taken to Nauru, where they were processed. And now a number of countries came together, Australia, Indonesia, Thailand, etc., in order to try and come up with a framework to look into a number of issues. And there was this particular focus on smuggling and trafficking. And recently, in June 2011, in Amman, Jordan, again, some countries got together in order to look at the issue of rescue at sea and how to come to have a concerted effort in the resolution of some of the situations they were faced with. And followed Djibouti in November 2011 as well, the same idea, which is to try and come up with a collaborative effort in the area of resolution of rescue at sea situations, because it was posing a certain number of problems, as Somalis in particular were crossing over into Yemen, but in some cases they were not even allowed to dock, and they were pretty much in orbit until such time that the US in particular intervened and said something needed to be done. And lastly, we are in the process of organizing another one in May 2013 on mixed migration and good practices in the Caribbean. That would also involve extra-regional countries like the US and Canada in order to try and come up with better ways of looking at situations of mixed migration in the region. To conclude, again, states never choose their neighbors. Tanzania never chose to be in between 8 other refugee-generating countries, whilst Tanzania itself never produced refugees, but it has been receiving refugees since its independence in the 1960s. And again, there are certain other principles, norms and principles of customary international law that have got to be respected regardless of circumstances. And again, here it is no excuse, no refoulement. States are prohibited from returning individuals to a situation of danger or where their liberties would be threatened. No state can handle displacement alone. Others have got to chip in order to assist, and that way the regime of international protection is strengthened, and host countries are encouraged in that respect, and they would continue, hopefully, to uphold their international obligations. The third countries, yes, they do chip in or kick in, but host countries are expected as well to pick up the weight. They carry the burden as well, and that way it is burden sharing and not burden shifting. And there is a need for tools and mechanisms, like, for example, the Bali process, where you do have some structures. Yes, they are ad hoc, but they are there, and on an annual basis, countries do get together in order to organize workshops and look into specific issues of interest to the Asia-Pacific region in order, again, to strengthen the regime of international protection. Voila, I've come to the conclusion of my presentation, and Mr. Ambassador, I think that you were saying maybe that questions are going to be combined?
Muchas gracias, señor Keil, quien ha mostrado su amplia trayectoria de formación en Derecho Público en la Universidad de Besançon, máster en Derecho en la Universidad de Nancy, igualmente con doctorado en Derecho Internacional Público y en solución de conflictos, de manera que le agradecemos mucho su exposición y, según lo convenido, abrimos un espacio para preguntas y comentarios. Voy a recordarles, así me lo ha solicitado nuestro Departamento de Derecho, que quienes asisten se inscriban para los efectos pertinentes de certificación, etcétera, de manera que a quienes no lo han hecho los invitamos a hacerlo. Han solicitado la palabra, entonces, en su orden, el doctor José Luis Ramírez, ministro de la Misión de Colombia.
Muchas gracias, presidente. La verdad, primero que todo, felicitarlo por la propuesta y realización de este evento, el apoyo de la Secretaría y muy especialmente de los expositores que creo que han colmado las expectativas que teníamos. Y en segundo lugar, el hecho de que haya una participación tan activa hoy en esta sesión demuestra el interés que este tipo de sesiones tienen y la importancia pedagógica de las mismas. Y tal vez ese carácter académico de curso ayuda muchísimo a poder ver estos temas con mayor detenimiento. En las ponencias o los comentarios que se hacían ahora, y especialmente por parte de Pamela Goldberg con el tema de la comunidad LGBTI, que se hablaba de lo difícil que es en algunas de nuestras sociedades y por temas culturales entender estos cambios. Y a pesar de que a veces la legislación de los países establece que no deben existir ningún tipo de cuestionamientos por temas de género o preferencias sexuales, desafortunadamente estas condiciones no llegan de la misma manera y de inmediato a todos los sectores de la sociedad y a veces incluso del mismo gobierno, de pronto en alguno de los casos que Pamela mencionaba ahora. Recordando, y más como una cuestión académica, Pamela, el año pasado tuvo lugar en Colombia un hecho bien interesante que tuvo repercusión en los medios de comunicación. Un periodista originario de los Estados Unidos había solicitado la adopción de 2 niños colombianos. El juez que miraba el tema estuvo de acuerdo con que así fuera, pero el instituto encargado del manejo del tema, cuando el periodista se declaró gay, decidió que no podía dar a los niños en adopción. Él interpuso una acción de tutela, que es un mecanismo previsto en la Constitución colombiana, para que se estudiara el caso y la Corte Constitucional determinó que tenía todo el derecho de tener a los dos niños y en efecto le fueron entregados. Es decir, esto para explicar que a veces se pueden presentar algunos problemas, es inevitable y en nuestros países sucede porque culturalmente no es sencillo, pero existen unas instituciones que funcionan y funcionan muy bien y gracias a la Constitución del año 91 y del mecanismo de la tutela, la Corte Constitucional reglamentó este derecho y no solamente de un ciudadano colombiano, sino de un ciudadano de los Estados Unidos que quería hacer la adopción de sus dos niños. Entonces, dado que el ambiente es académico, me pareció pertinente traer este caso a referencia y comentarlo acá. Gracias, presidente.
Representante de Antigua y Barbuda, Judy Davis, y luego el señor Summers.
Thank you, sir. I would just like to address the presentation made by Ms. Goldberg. Thank you so much. It was quite informative, but I am happy to announce, and this is in reference to your citing of various litigation or instruments that address the concept of SOGI, is that what you said? Gender SOGI. Yes, well, I'm happy to report that there is currently being drafted an Inter-American Instrument Against All Forms of Discrimination and Intolerance. I have the privilege of chairing that working group, and the draft instrument does address non-discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. So hopefully in the not too distant future, you would be able to cite that instrument as a binding document which addresses this issue. Thank you.
Thank you. I had no idea about that. Thank you for that information. I look forward to seeing the instrument.
Gracias, Embajador. Just two quick questions and one brief comment to Ms. Goldberg. To add to to what was indicated by Jody Davis on the institutional side of things, I'd like to indicate that in November 2011, the Inter-American Commission established a unit specifically devoted to LGBTI issues. So it's been up and running for just over a year. And secondly, in 2011, I think for the first time, the Commission issued precautionary measures to protect Jamaicans, gay men who were at risk and certainly could conceivably qualify as asylum seekers, given the sort of threats that they faced. I would like to ask, though, whether you have any data on refugees from the Americas to Europe. The reason why I ask is that you had your point of departure, as I understood it, was the U.S. and Canada. However, I know certainly as a fact that there are a number of Caribbean persons, particularly Jamaicans, who seek asylum in the places like United Kingdom, for reasons of history. And so I'm wondering whether you have any data on that. And secondly, in that respect, I'm wondering whether the UN has filed any amicus briefs in any of the litigation that has taken place with respect to asylum requests in the UK, because they have built up a fair amount of jurisprudence. And finally, a small comment, and this is in relation to your website. I noticed on your website that you have a rather extensive list of the people that you specifically assist, but LGBTI people are not listed, and I'd be curious to know why not.
Thank you for your observations and comments. I don't have any hard data on the number of claims brought by individuals from the Americas in Europe, although I am aware that it does happen, of course, obviously the geographic location plays a big role in how people may have access. But then, of course, people manage to get places. Even people with few resources find ways to get places where they think they'll find safety. So I know it exists, I know it happens. I don't have any information on the numbers. That's something I can, unless Juan Carlos has an idea about it, that's something I can check with our headquarters to see if they have any sense of that. Then on the issue of filing amicus briefs, yes, we have filed amicus briefs in support of a broad range of issues relating to refugee protection throughout the U.S., Canada, and Europe. No specific case concerning LGBTI in Europe comes immediately to mind, but I do believe there have been instances, and I know for a fact there are cases in the U.S. where we have filed amicus briefs on claims involving LGBTI issues. But that's something else that I could find, or that could fairly easily be found on our RefWorld website. Because any of our amicus briefs that are in the public domain are accessible through our website, and there are different ways. It's not the most friendly search, but there are ways to search by topic, so you may be able to find it that way if you'd like. And you can always contact me if you'd like me to help you find those things. As to why LGBTI are not listed as a separate category, we don't list every single category, but perhaps we should take a look at, in particular, I'm thinking about our categories of particularly vulnerable individuals. That would be a place where we might reference, and we have referenced in other contexts, that LGBTI or persons fearing persecution based on their sexual orientation or gender identity often are particularly vulnerable. But why it's not specifically delineated on the website, I can't speak to that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I would like to echo the sentiments that the presentations throughout the day, from my part, have been very, very enlightening, and we thank you for this course. My question specifically has to do with, how do you ferret out the cases that are those where you have economic refugees who are under the guise of being persecuted for their sexuality, seek asylum in countries, especially Canada, or St. Vincent has had this ongoing battle with domestic violence cases which it is claiming are bogus. So how do you ferret out what are indeed the genuine cases from the cases of those who are seeking escape for purely economic reasons? Thank you.
Congratulations. You get the prize for hitting on one of the most sensitive issues in this whole area. Because, of course, in these kinds of situations, credibility is of the utmost importance. Refugees often leave without anything. Even if they are able to bring personal belongings, the nature of their flight often means that they can't obtain the kinds of documentation that we would get in the course of regular business in our lives in most circumstances. In some countries, records are not even kept, even if they could have access to them. In some cases, family members or they themselves would be subjected to further danger if they even tried to get documentation proving their claim. And certainly a claim based on sexual orientation or gender identity, in particular sexual orientation, is especially difficult because there are not many earmarks that you can rely on. And so it is in every situation It is a challenge to maintain an open mind, to assess the testimony in view of what is known about the circumstances and conditions in the country of origin, to the extent that the treatment of LGBTI are known, is known, that would be an important factor. To the extent that it's not known, of course, there's no foolproof way to know when someone is or is not telling the truth, but there are markers. And again, as several people have referenced, I'm sure it's been a theme throughout the day, there are a lot of cultural and language and interpretation issues involved in trying to read those cues as to credibility. So it's laden with difficulties. Ultimately, in the view of UNHCR, we feel strongly that the benefit of the doubt should go to the applicant, and that in those cases where it's not clear, that should be a primary consideration, that an individual, it's more important that an individual in need of protection receives it than that a person who may not be in need receives it, so, or is denied. So other than that, I can only say that it's an issue of critical importance both to us and to virtually any state that does refugee status determination. And the last point I'll make is that we are currently engaged in a broad study to try to further develop what are the earmarks of a careful, considered credibility assessment. And that is ongoing through our headquarters right now. And probably the results won't be available till the end of 2013 or sometime in 2014. But again, knowing that there's not a single dispositive answer, but hopefully it will move us further along in this process.
Yeah, let me also add and say that we usually confronted with that kind of question, and which is quite legitimate. For UNHCR, we are interested in making sure that individuals do not take advantage of the international refugee protection, because if they did, the regime itself would be eroded. And when that happens, you find that bona fide cases may not get into the system. So we want to make sure that we do get it right. But it's also worth noting that not every refugee does apply for refugee status. Not every refugee does apply for refugee status, especially in situations where, for example, you do have a lot of alternatives. Because I think there is absolutely no glory in being a refugee or being considered a refugee. So people who do try and have access to those procedures have got to be looked at in a very careful manner to make sure that those who are deserving of international protection do get it.
Mil gracias. No tenemos otras preguntas o comentarios, de manera que vamos a tomar un receso, un break de 5 minutos máximo para escuchar luego a nuestro embajador de Jamaica. Muy bien.